The story always starts the same way. A man arrives at a prison. He is tall, well-made, and carries himself with dignity. But no one can see his face. It is hidden behind a mask. He lives this way for decades, moved from one fortress to another, always under the watch of the same jailer. He is treated well, given fine clothes and good food. But he can never speak his name. He can never show his face. When he dies, his cell is stripped bare. The furniture is burned, the walls scraped clean, as if to erase any trace that he ever existed. This is the legend of the Man in the Iron Mask. It is one of history's great unsolved mysteries. For over 300 years, people have tried to figure out who he was. Was he a king's brother? A disgraced general? A crooked diplomat? The truth is, we still don't know for sure. But we have clues, we have letters, prison records, and a whole lot of theories. The real story is less about iron masks and royal twins, and more about secrets, power, and how a state can make a person disappear. First, let's get the facts straight. Or at least, the facts as we can piece them together from historical documents. There really was a prisoner. He wasn't a ghost or a figment of someone's imagination. His story begins around 1669. A man was arrested and taken to the prison of Pignerol, a fortress high in the French Alps. His jailer was a man named Benigne d'Auvergne de Saint-Mars. This is a key name. Saint Mars was an ambitious, meticulous man. His entire career would become tied to this one mysterious prisoner. The prisoner was kept in high security. The Minister of War, a powerful man named Louvois, sent very specific instructions to Saint Mars. He wrote that the prisoner should not be allowed to communicate with anyone. If he ever spoke about anything other than his basic needs, Saint Mars was to kill him immediately. These were not the orders for a common criminal, this was for someone who knew something. Something so dangerous that the mere whisper of it was a death sentence. The mask itself is part of the legend, but it probably wasn't made of iron. That was a later invention made popular by the writer Voltaire. An iron mask would have been incredibly uncomfortable. It would have caused sores and infections, it would have been a form of torture. But the prisoner was treated with respect. He was given books, allowed to play the lute, and even attended mass, though he was kept apart from others. The mask was most likely black velvet, held together with steel clasps. It was designed not to torture him, but to hide him. To erase his identity completely. For years, the prisoner stayed at Pignerol. Then St. Mars was promoted. He became the governor of another prison, Exilies, a nearby fortress. He took the prisoner with him. A few years later, St. Mars was moved again, this time to the island of Sainte Marguerite, just off the coast of Cannes. The prisoner went too. A special cell was built for him. Finally, in 1698, St. Mars was given the most prestigious post of all governor of the Bastille in Paris. And, of course, his prisoner, now an old man, made the final journey with him. He arrived in Paris in a closed litter, a kind of covered chair carried by servants. The mask was still on his face. He lived in the Bastille for 5 years. In November 1703, he fell ill and died suddenly. He was buried the next day in the Paris cemetery under the name Marchioli. Immediately after his death, his room was completely sanitized. His clothes, bedding, and furniture were all burned. The silver plates he ate from were melted down. The walls of his cell were scraped and whitewashed. The floor tiles were ripped up. The state didn't just want him dead, they wanted him erased from history. So, who was he? Why the decades of secrecy? The extreme measures taken after his death point to one thing: his identity was the secret. If anyone saw his face, they might recognize him, and that recognition could bring down the entire kingdom of Louis XIV, the Sun King. This is where the theories begin. The most famous theory, the one everyone knows from books and movies, is that the prisoner was the identical twin brother of King Louis XIV. This idea was popularized by the great French writer Alexandre Dumas in his novel The Vicomte de Bragelonne, which is the final part of his Three Musketeers saga. In Dumas' story, the king has a secret twin named Philippe. To prevent a civil war over who should be king, the twin is hidden away from birth. Later, he is imprisoned and forced to wear the iron mask so no one can see that he has the same face as the King of France. It's a fantastic story, it's dramatic, romantic, and it explains the high level of secrecy perfectly. If a second Louis XIV was walking around, it would be a massive threat to the throne. Anyone with a grudge against the king could rally around the twin and claim he was the rightful heir. It makes for great fiction. But as history, it falls apart. The birth of a French king was a very public event. When Louis XIV was born in 1638, the royal bedchamber was filled with nobles and officials. Their job was to witness the birth and confirm that the baby was a legitimate heir. There was no way to hide a second baby. The Queen, Anne of Austria, was attended by doctors and midwives. the King Louis XIII was there, dozens of people would have had to be part of a massive conspiracy, and a secret that big is almost impossible to keep. For over 300 years, not a single credible document has ever surfaced to support the twin theory. It's a legend, born from the mind of a novelist, but the legend points to something important. People believe the prisoner had to be someone of very high birth, the level of respect he was shown, the care taken with his imprisonment, suggested he was not a commoner. This led to other theories about his royal connections. Another popular candidate was a man named James de la Cloche. This theory suggests he was the illegitimate son of King Charles, the Second of England. The story goes that Charles II used the secret son as an envoy to the French court. He knew secrets about English and French foreign policy. Perhaps he betrayed his father or learned something he shouldn't have, and Louis XIV had him locked away to protect his alliance with England. It's an intriguing idea, but it has problems. Would the King of France go to such lengths for 34 years just to silence the illegitimate son of another king? It seems like an overreaction. The prisoner's secret felt personal to France, not to England. So if he wasn't a royal twin or an English secret agent, who else could he be? For a long time, the leading candidate was an Italian diplomat named Count Ercole Antonio Mattioli. This theory had some strong evidence going for it. Mattioli was a real person. He was a minister for the Duke of Mantua in Italy. In the late 1670s, he was involved in secret negotiations to sell a strategic fortress, Casale, to France. Louis XIV wanted the fortress badly. Mattioli acted as the middleman, but Mattioli was a double dealer. After taking a bribe from the French, he revealed the secret plan to France's enemies. Louis XIV was furious. This was a personal betrayal and a public embarrassment. He ordered his agents to kidnap Mattioli. In 1679, the diplomat was snatched from Italian soil and thrown into the French prison of Pignerol, the same prison where our masked man was being held. He was put under the care of the same jailer, St. Mars. This theory seemed to fit. Mattioli was a real person, arrested for betraying the king. His crime was serious enough to warrant a long imprisonment, and the name he was buried under, Marculi, is very close to Mattioli. For many historians in the 19th century, this was the solution. The case was closed. But there were problems. The timeline didn't quite match up. The mysterious prisoner was first mentioned in 1669, a full 10 years before Mattioli was arrested. Also, Mattioli's imprisonment wasn't a total secret. Many people in Italy knew what had happened to him. The French weren't trying to erase his existence, just to punish him. Records show that Mattioli was allowed to have a valet with him in prison, and he was a notoriously loud and difficult prisoner, often shouting from his cell. The masked man, on the other hand, was kept in silent isolation. He was one man, alone. Most historians now agree that Mattioli was a prisoner at Pignerol, but he was not the prisoner. There were two different men who happened to share the same jail for a while. Another theory centered on Nicolas Fouquet, Louis XIV's incredibly wealthy and powerful Minister of Finance. In 1661, Fouquet was at the height of his power. He was richer than the king, building a magnificent chateau that put the royal palaces to shame. He was also corrupt. Louis XIV, a young and proud king, saw Fouquet as a rival. He had him arrested for embezzlement. Fouquet was put on trial and sentenced to life in prison. Where was he sent? Pignerol, under the guard of St. Mars. Fouquet definitely knew state secrets. He had managed the kingdom's finances for years. He knew about the king's mistresses, his secret deals, his political weaknesses. So, the theory goes that Fouquet didn't die in prison in 1680 as the official records claim. Instead, he was kept alive, his face hidden under the mask, to prevent him from ever sharing what he knew. This would explain the high security. The problem here is that Fouquet's death is pretty well documented. His family was notified, there were witnesses. It would have been very difficult to fake his death and then move him around France for another 23 years. Also, by the 1680s, Fouquet's secrets were old news. Louis XIV was secure on his throne. It doesn't seem likely that he would go to such elaborate lengths to silence a man who was no longer a threat. But the story of Fouquet brings us to what is now considered the most likely, if less romantic, solution to the mystery. It leads us to a man named Eustache Dogger. This is the name that modern historians keep coming back to. Unlike the royal twin, Eustache Dogger was a real person. His name appears in the letters between the minister Louvois and the jailer St. Mars. In July 1669, Louvois wrote to St. Mars to expect a new prisoner, a man named Eustache Dogger. The letter contained those chilling instructions. He was a man of little consequence, just a valet. But he was not to speak to anyone, and if he did, he was to be killed without hesitation. Who was this Eustache Dogger? That's the tricky part. The name was common enough, and records from that time are patchy. but researchers have found a man named Eustache Daguerre involved in some very shady business in the 1660s. This Daguerre was mixed up in scandals involving poison, black magic, and political conspiracy at the highest levels of the French court. This was the Affair of the Poisons, a massive scandal that implicated some of the king's closest friends and even his mistress. One theory is that this Daguerre was a valet, but not just any valet. He might have been the valet to a very important person, someone who knew a dangerous secret. Perhaps he served a nobleman who was plotting against the king, or maybe he worked for Fouquet, the disgraced finance minister, and knew the real extent of his corruption, which might have implicated the king himself. There is another, more specific theory about Daguerre's secret. It connects him to a man named Rue de Marsilly, a French Protestant, who was trying to get England to attack France. Marsilly was captured and executed in 1669. His plot involved a lot of secret negotiations. He had a valet who helped him, a man who knew all the details. Some historians believe that Eustache Daguerre was this valet. After his master's execution, Daguerre was arrested to make sure he could never reveal the names of other conspirators, some of whom might have been powerful people at the French court that the king didn't want to expose. But there's a problem with Daguerre being a simple valet. The way he was treated doesn't quite fit. He was given a nice cell. He wasn't put in chains. St. Mars refers to him with a degree of respect. And why the mask? A valet's face wouldn't be recognizable to anyone important. The secrecy seems too extreme for a low-level servant. This leads to another, more compelling theory about who Daguerre was. It suggests Daguerre was a false name, that he was not a valet at all, but someone much more important whose identity had to be hidden. What if he was involved in a secret that was not just political, but deeply personal to the king? Some historians have suggested that the prisoner was a disgraced churchman, or even a relative of the king's chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin. Mazarin had amassed a huge fortune, and perhaps Daguerre knew where it was hidden, or knew that it had been acquired illegally. Another theory suggests he was the real father of one of Louis XIV's illegitimate children. Exposing that would have caused a huge scandal in the deeply Catholic court. The most intriguing theory about Daguerre connects back to Fouquet. When Fouquet was imprisoned at Pignerol, he had a valet with him. Valets in those days were more like personal assistants. They knew everything about their masters. Fouquet was a notorious womanizer and a political schemer. He had deep, dark secrets. Perhaps his valet Daguerre knew something that even the king's spies couldn't find out. Maybe Fouquet had proof that the king had made a secret treaty with England that would have outraged the French public. Or maybe he knew something about the king's private life. After Fouquet died, what would happen to the valet who knew too much? He couldn't be released, he couldn't be killed without cause. The solution would be to keep him locked up forever, his identity erased, so he could never speak. The mask would have been necessary because people at Pignerol had seen him as Fouquet's servant. If he was moved to another prison, someone might recognize him and ask questions. This valid theory seems the most plausible. It accounts for the name Eustache Daguerre in the letters. It explains the timing of his arrest. It explains the need for lifelong imprisonment. But it still doesn't fully explain the extraordinary level of secrecy, the threat to kill him if he speaks, the burning of all his belongings after his death. These actions seem reserved for a threat against the king himself. This is why the mystery endures. Every theory has a hole in it. Every piece of evidence can be interpreted in different ways. The twin theory explains the secrecy but is historically impossible. The Mattioli theory has a similar name but the wrong timeline. The Fouquet theory has a strong motive but conflicts with the records of his death. The Daguerre theory has a name and a date, but the man himself is a ghost and his crime is unknown. We are left with a puzzle, where the most important piece is missing the secret. What could be so terrible that a man had to be buried alive for 34 years? It must have been something that questioned the very legitimacy of Louis XIV. The king ruled by divine right. He was God's chosen representative on earth. His authority had to be absolute and unquestionable. Any secret that undermined that authority would have been a threat to the entire country. This is where the power of the legend comes from. The man in the mask becomes a symbol. He is a blank space. We don't know his face, his voice, or his story, so we fill in the blanks with our own fears and fascination. We imagine he was a wronged brother, a noble hero, a victim of tyranny. He represents the ultimate injustice to have your identity, your very existence, stolen from you by an all-powerful state. The jailer, St. Mars, is also a fascinating part of the story. He was a man of ordinary origins who rose to become a powerful and respected figure. His whole life, from 1669 until his own death, was dedicated to guarding this one man. He moved when the prisoner moved. His promotions were tied to the prisoner. He complained about the responsibility, but he also seemed to take a certain pride in it. He was the keeper of the king's greatest secret. In a way, his own identity became as tied to the prisoner as the mask was to the prisoner's face. He was not just a jailer, he was the warden of a living ghost. In the end, we may never know the truth. The secret was kept too well. Louis XIV and his ministers took it to their graves. The cell was scraped clean, the evidence was burned. All we have left are tantalizing clues and dusty letters and the enduring power of a great story. The most likely candidate is Eustache Dagger, not a prince or a nobleman, but an ordinary man who got caught up in something extraordinary. He was probably a valet or a minor conspirator who knew a secret so dangerous that the state had to make him disappear. The secret was likely about political corruption, a secret treaty, or a major scandal at court. It was something that, if revealed, would have embarrassed or weakened the king. The mask was not for torture, but for control. It was a tool to enforce anonymity. The legend of the Iron Mask and the Royal Twin are later additions, embellishments that made a good story into a great one. They tap into our love of conspiracy and our suspicion of absolute power, but the reality is perhaps even more chilling. The man in the mask was probably not a king. He was just a man. A man who knew something. And in the France of Louis XIV, what you knew could get you killed. Or it could get you something worse, a long, silent life where you ceased to be a person and became a secret. The real horror of the story is not who he was, but that a human being could be so completely and successfully erased. That is the true and unsolved mystery of the man in the Iron Mask. He is a testament to the fact that some secrets are kept forever.